On this episode of Distant Replay, we're going back to true crime. Today we're talking about Eddie Johnson, the former NBA player. We will explain and clarify for sure on the show which Eddie Johnson we're talking about, since there were multiple that played in the NBA, and actually it caused a lot of trouble to the guy that wasn't involved in the story. But this is a really dark story, mental health story about a guy that just was dealing with a lot of demons, it seemed like, but it resulted in some pretty horrific actions that we'll detail here on this episode. This is the story of Eddie Johnson, who was serving life in prison but passed away in late 2020.
This is Distant Replay.
We're back on true crime here on Distant Replay, and today we're going into Eddie Johnson, NBA player. And Mike, I just want to start right at the top, because Eddie Johnson's a pretty common name, but even more so in the NBA. I think it's important to point out, which Eddie Johnson are we talking about today?
Yep. So this is not the Eddie Johnson that is the current analyst for the Phoenix Suns and who played from 1981 to 1999 for the Kings, Suns, Sonics, Hornets, Pacers, and Rockets. This is not him. Okay?
Gotcha.
This story caused a lot of issues for that Eddie Johnson, as we'll get to later. But this is another Eddie Johnson who played in the NBA from 1977 to 1986.
Yeah, and it's important to point that out as we're going, obviously, to make sure you aren't confused. He's already dealt with enough through all this that it's not worth even making you even think twice about whether or not it's that Eddie Johnson. We're talking about fast Eddie Johnson. So we'll get into all that today. We'll get to his career, his life, everything that he was charged and convicted of. But again, I'll remind you, we can find our show in many different places, and we hope that you subscribe everywhere that you follow us: YouTube, podcasting, Twitter, Instagram, distantreplaypodcast.com, all these different avenues to stay in touch with us as we do more and more content. We appreciate everybody's feedback. But let's get to Eddie Johnson in this true crime episode, Mike. And as we always do, we start with some background.
Yeah, so fast Eddie Johnson, oldest of 5 children, grew up in Ocala, Florida. Attended high school in Ocala, Florida. As you can imagine, a very accomplished high school basketball player. Went to Auburn from 73 to 77. He was all SEC 3 times. He led the nation in scoring as a freshman, 28 points per game. Led all freshmen, I should say, in scoring at 21.8 points per game. Very good player. Averaged 20 points every year but his senior year. Productive player. But there's a lot of rumblings of him not having the best attitude. All right. And a lot of those rumblings came directly from his head coach at Auburn, different teammates at Auburn. So maybe not necessarily the best guy, but a productive player. So as we see kind of this day and age also, it led to him being drafted, but maybe not as high as his stats would indicate he probably should be. So he got drafted in the 3rd round of the NBA draft. Back then, the NBA draft did not only have 2 rounds. So he got drafted in the 3rd round, 49th overall by the Hawks. He would be known as a professional largely for playing with the Hawks. He played with the Hawks from 77 to 86, and with the Cavs in 1986 and the Sonics in 1987. Now, we're dealing with a player here, Ben, who averaged 15 points per game for his career. He was a 2-time All-Star and even started an All-Star game.
Yeah, really a player. And it's always interesting to me to hear you provide their background, because, sometimes in these cases, there are guys that have a pretty clean past, that are just pretty normal guys on the surface and everybody that you talk to. But I guess this case is a little bit different. This is one of the more, I guess, stereotypical kind of a background that was a little questionable, attitude that was not very favorable for a lot of teammates. So kind of sets up maybe where his life and his career is headed.
Yeah, there are warning signs all over the place for the behavior that Eddie Johnson would take part in, both while he was a professional basketball player and afterwards, all right? And a lot of Eddie Johnson's issues revolved around 2 things. Number 1, he was clinically diagnosed as having manic depression, okay? Because of that, he had severe mood changes. Those mood changes would happen for little or no reason. His behavior would be very erratic. This is a constant issue throughout his adult life, right?
Okay.
He fought the diagnosis at every turn. He fought taking his medicine. He basically was of the mindset that he thought he was less of a man for having these kind of mental issues, right? And it plagued him his whole life. That was the first issue. The second issue was problems with drugs. Now, some of that got attributed to him when he was in the NBA of just hanging out with the wrong crowd. I don't know if you remember this, Ben, but in the 70s and very early 80s, the NBA had a huge crack cocaine problem.
A little bit. I kind of remember that, yeah.
All right, so it's widespread in the league. Numerous news stories done on this. You can look it up. And he fell victim to this, epidemic of crack cocaine infiltrating the NBA. All right? I mean, it was to the point where even his own general manager, the GM of the Hawks, said he thought 75% of players in the NBA did some form of crack or cocaine on a regular basis.
Ooh.
That's how bad it was.
Wow.
You know when they talk about how Magic and Bird saved the NBA?
Yeah.
Well, this is what is thought they saved the NBA from, right? This time period. And the reason I bring that up is Eddie Johnson's right in the middle of this, okay? Right in the middle of the drug use to go along with having manic depression. Now, because of his erratic behavior that stemmed from his condition, his mental condition that I just described, there's even articles from back in the day, from the early 80s that I found that sort of describe some of the criminal behavior and some of the erratic behavior that he took part in even while he was a player. So I'm just going to throw some of these stories at you, Ben, and get your reaction.
Okay.
All right? In June 1980, he makes news for jumping out of a second-story apartment balcony while two people were shooting at him.
Gee.
Okay?
God.
He gets away, doesn't press charges. He just says, look, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. These guys burst in the door and started shooting guns everywhere, and I ran out of there. Police say it was a drug deal gone bad, and people came to that apartment to kill Eddie Johnson, and then he ran away. 3 weeks after that, he's arrested for possession of cocaine. And the reason he was arrested for possession of cocaine is a realtor called the police and said, this guy just gave me a deposit for a house. You know how you give a deposit for a rental?
Right.
And for some reason, he thinks that means he can move in right now, but he can't move in right now. He's in the house illegally. Right?
Yeah.
So during the course of being, the cops pulling him over for that, they find drugs in his car. Now, the charges were thrown out because it was deemed that the search of his car was illegal.
Okay. Skating by.
What's interesting now is that while those charges were getting sorted out for 3 days, his lawyer left him in jail because the lawyer said, hey, look, this is the best place for him given his mental state.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And at the recommendation of a psychiatrist who did an initial evaluation of his condition, they advised that he be moved from the prison to an Atlanta psych facility. After a very short period of time, he checks himself out of that facility against the wishes of his family and friends and gets arrested again for stealing a Porsche from a Porsche dealership.
Jeez. So he's in a very bad spot right now.
He's in a bad, just erratic stuff. He claims he was out for a long test drive.
Of course. Yeah.
So he claims, hey, they let me test drive it. This is not funny, though. If you know anyone who's been through mental, I'm not laughing at the fact that he's obviously mentally in a really bad place. Just trying to speak to his erratic behavior and how bizarre it is and all over the map it is. He's out for a long test drive, he claims. The criminal charges are dropped, and he checks back into the psych facility. Okay? But some other erratic behavior due to his condition. He randomly called the Atlanta Journal-Constitution one time to tell them that he was traded to the Lakers.
Okay.
And the AJC called the Hawks and is this true? And they're like, no, don't pay attention to that.
Wow.
One offseason, he went right from the psych hospital to the team's first practice and became automatically disruptive.
Jeez.
The players on his team thought, man, this guy's really on drugs. They had no clue about the manic depression.
Yeah.
And the role that played. That would be a major theme. His mental condition was sort of kept a secret. And everyone just thought he was just wildly crazy on drugs, which I think was the case, but he also had other issues.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember Kevin Lockery. He was a coach in the NBA in the 80s.
Not really.
So he was a coach of the Hawks back then, and he walked into this situation. He wasn't given any heads up on his mental condition or anything. And he said just randomly, one time he left practice, went into the stands and started talking to a young kid, just having a conversation, just randomly left practice. Mm-hmm. He would... one time he just took a jump rope and started jump roping on the sideline, oblivious to everything. During practice, I guess back then when you got committed to a facility like that, it would sort of look like you were getting arrested, they would come and serve you with papers and take you away. Okay? In the middle of a practice, they came on the court to serve him with papers and take him away, and no one knew what was going on. His teammates didn't know what was going on. They thought he was being arrested and came to his defense.
Huh. Wow.
He dealt with similar issues to this regarding drugs and his mental condition throughout his entire NBA career. He tried to make comebacks, like I mentioned, when he joined the Cavs in '86 and the Sonics in '87, but in the end, he could never kick the habit with drugs to go along with the issues with the manic depression. In 1987, he got arrested for selling crack to an undercover officer, and that leads to him just getting banned from the NBA.
Man,
they just say, kind of enough is enough. Again,
Yeah.
they're trying to clean. They're still. The league's in a totally different place at this time. They don't need to deal with a guy. We're in the middle of the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird era. Jordan's on the scene. Like, we don't need to deal with Eddie Johnson and his drugs anymore. Mm-hmm. So he gets banned from the NBA. After he retired, when Johnson would talk to news outlets, he said he had been arrested nearly 100 times for a variety of crimes.
jeez. Wow.
They range from burglary to drug possession to theft. He's in and out of jail constantly from the end of his NBA career, through 2006, so nearly 20 years. Arrest records show that in his home county of Marion County, going back to his, Ocala is where he went after he retired. He was arrested 30 times just in that county alone for different offenses.
Damn. It's wild.
Crazy, right? Absolutely wild. So that gives a little background into his mental state, his drug addiction, and sort of where we are entering his retirement and in the year of 2006.
Oh, so you fast forward quite a ways, and I mean, you can kind of see the foundation. I mean, I mentioned there's a lot of signs for some cases, sometimes there's not, and you're right. This is it's a mental health problem, number one, right? And you just kind of wonder, like, what can you do in these cases to help keep somebody in check? And it's obviously difficult after the fact, but I'm afraid to hear what's coming.
Yeah, so Ben, from 87 to 2006, his rap sheet was so long, we could just have a podcast reading the rap sheet.
Yeah.
But like I mentioned, we're talking, the crimes revolved around drugs, burglary to get money for those drugs, and stealing things to get money for those drugs, okay? Just to put it really, really in the most basic way possible. So now 2006 comes. In August of 2006, he's arrested in the early morning of August 6th when a woman alleges she was sleeping in her hotel room. Johnson entered the hotel room, choked her, and forced her to have sex with him.
Jeez.
She was screaming for him to get off, and Johnson just said, basically, be quiet or I'll kill you. All right. She identifies Johnson as her attacker via a photo lineup. She said she had met Johnson about a month earlier, was really kind of creeped out by him to the point where she had to have a friend, get him to leave her alone. You know that situation where someone's just so uncomfortable with someone, they have to get someone else involved to tell the guy, hey, look, just get out of here. She's not interested.
Yeah, that's what we're dealing with here.
That's what we're dealing with. And then, like she said, a month later, this incident happened in a hotel room. So he gets arrested on sexual assault charges for this incident, okay? He gets released on bond. So we could get into a whole discussion about someone with, let's say, 30 or more incidents of being arrested, how they could be charged with a crime like this and get bond so easily. We could have a conversation about that, But nonetheless, he is released on bond, awaiting trial on those sexual assault charges. And that leads to what Eddie Johnson would eventually get put in prison for the rest of his life for, okay?
Okay.
Now, the following I'm about to tell you, we heard directly from the victim at trial, right? The victim, unfortunately, in this case, is an 8-year-old, okay? The 8-year-old alleged that Johnson entered her home uninvited. It was an apartment, okay? She was home, 8-year-old girl home with her 3 brothers. They were left under the care of a babysitter who had stepped outside for a minute, supposedly. Their mother wasn't home because she was registering them for school. So you have 8-year-old girl, 3 brothers home. Johnson enters the home uninvited. He supposedly knew the family. Everyone knew him, but he was not given permission to enter their home. Johnson took the 8-year-old girl, ordered her into a bedroom, and I'm sure you've done this at some point in your life where you put a dresser in front of something to block the entry to a door.
Yeah, or some kind of
Right.
furniture, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what he did. He orders her into the bedroom, puts her dresser in front of the door to block entry, and sexually assaults her.
Jeez.
And again, we're hearing this from the 8-year-old at trial. How she had the courage to get on the stand and tell this story, I don't know, but incredible. He told her not to tell anyone what happened. Tried to kiss her as he left the apartment, and she kind of pulled away. As soon as the mother comes home, she finds the 8-year-old girl curled up in a ball on her brother's bed crying. Obviously, the mother says, hey, why are you crying? She tells her mother the whole story of what happened, and the mother reports him to the police. The mother said again she knew Johnson, but Johnson never had permission to be in her home. Johnson denied the allegations, and his lawyer's case centered around the fact that there was no physical evidence of assault and that Johnson was a mentor to the girl's older brother and that he was in the house frequently. So sort of explaining why he was in the house, because he not only would be charged with sexual assault of the 8-year-old, he was also charged with like robbery for breaking into the house. Okay. So those were the explanations that his lawyer gave at trial for both the charges. No physical evidence. And hey, my client was in the house all the time. He wasn't breaking in. Right. 2 days of testimony. The verdict was delivered in an hour and a half. He's found guilty of sexual battery and molestation of the 8-year-old. And in Florida, because the victim was under 12 years old, that carries a mandatory life sentence.
Good.
Good is right. I mean, that's exactly the feeling I had when I was reading it. So he goes on. He's in jail now, sentenced to mandatory life sentence for the sexual assault of the 8-year-old. As far as the case he was out on bond for, the sexual assault of the older woman in the hotel where he broke into her room, I couldn't find any definitive end to that case, or that he even stood trial on those charges. Speculation, but maybe because of the fact that he went on trial for the charges associated with the 8-year-old, which had a mandatory life sentence. Maybe they didn't bring him up on charges formally and have a trial for the first incident. But this is again one of those cases where, I mean, we have a guy who, by his own admission, was arrested 100 times, never faced any consequences that landed him in jail for a prolonged period of time, never really faced consequences for his actions. And over the years, he evolves into a person like this, a monster who sexually assaults an 8-year-old and lands himself in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah. That's a pretty awful story. This is one of the worst ones I've had to listen to. It's just both disgusting and just infuriating at the same time. And it's just one of those two, like, you hate the mental health aspect of it, but it's like, at what point can somebody step in, or some entity step in to prevent anything getting worse, right? It seems like that there was an opportunity there. And there's a lot of times in these stories that you tell, where there's a chance to maybe prevent the worst case scenario from happening.
And you know what really got me about some of the stories I was reading was, people would fast forward past, the 100 incidents he got arrested for and say, well, none of those were really that serious, but here's what he got in trouble. Here's what he was in jail for. And sort of fast forward to it. It's like, well, wait a minute. Of those 100 things he got arrested for, maybe there's a pattern there that maybe he shouldn't have been on the street. I'm sure if I went through his 100 incidents, I could find something that maybe would be cause for him not to be around the public. So that turned me off in my research. Another thing just to go back to is the issues that the other Eddie Johnson had came in 2006 when these charges got reported. What people in the media were confusing the Eddie Johnsons.
Oh, man.
And the other Eddie Johnson I mentioned, who's now the analyst for the Suns, who had nothing to do with any of this at all, it's not even him. He was like on vacation and came home to like his name being slandered, to him getting death threats, to all this, because he's the more well-known Eddie Johnson in NBA circles. And I came away from this story feeling terrible for him. I mean, eventually, he cleared his name. He's not associated with any of this anymore. Thank goodness. But could you imagine being him?
No, that's brutal, man. That's we see that every now and then, when people get mixed up, and we laugh about it like on Twitter and stuff when somebody did something wrong and like the other guy with a similar name or the other woman with a similar name getting all the backlash. But then this is like real life, like very serious issues. And I mean, it's even one where you probably feel threatened in most cases, because anybody that feels like you did that to a child probably doesn't have a whole lot of restraint for you.
And this is news reports reporting this. So this is like, that these are supposed journalists who can't even do enough research. They would say his name, what teams he played for. They would do the first part of an article that does like a bio of who they're talking about and why they're relevant.
Yeah.
They would say his information, and it was like devastating to him. I can't imagine being in his shoes for that period of time, but apparently all is good now, and we're well past it, being 15 years later. But now getting back to Fast Eddie Johnson, he died in prison in October of 2020, and it was announced in November of 2020 that he had passed away in prison. No details on what he passed away from, just a statement from the prison letting us know that he expired.
Yeah, maybe COVID related, who knows? But man, what a story. Awful story. But when we want to tell here and share the details with you on Distant Replay, do you want to preview maybe what's coming up next? I know we kind of take it week by week sometimes, but I know you're always kind of cooking up some new true crime. And for those that have really got into the true crime episodes, and there's a lot of people out there, maybe give them a little preview of a story or a person or two that maybe you're working on or on your radar.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank people for the suggestion for this Eddie Johnson episode, because this was another listener suggestion. I should have mentioned that from the top. I'm working on 2 different 2-parters that I don't want to give away who they are right now.
Okay.
But I think people are going to be fascinated with them. And then we're also going to get into, in the next couple of weeks also, and in the coming months, into more popular names that you've heard of, but you may not be familiar with sort of the crimes they were accused of or had involvement in.
Okay.
Some big names. Like I'll give you one. Like I want to do a deep dive into Ray Lewis.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, just I think we're all familiar. He was maybe linked to something that happened after the Super Bowl with him with his fur coat on, but the details are fuzzy. I want to fill in the gaps there. That's an example of one. And then some 2-parters I'm working on that I think are just going to blow people's minds.
We'll definitely be looking forward to that, Mike. And if you want to be alerted when those come out, please hit subscribe on YouTube, on whatever podcasting app that you listen on. We're on all of them. You can find us there. And we look forward to talking to you on the next episode of Distant Replay.